An alarming number of children are still being subjected to corporal punishment despite it being abolished in the country in 1997. Education officials say safety in schools remains a priority with laws in place to protect learners. Let's unpack this issue further with attorney at Equal Education's Law Centre, Pila-sande Mkuzo, joins us via our video link this morning. Pila-sande, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming on. I mean, it's incredibly worrying, isn't it, to see these numbers insofar as how many children still face violence in schools, not from their peers, but from the people who are meant to be there to instruct them in various subjects, the people who are there for their education, exposing them to violence.
True. It's quite alarming. I mean, the fact that the act in itself has been criminalized and prohibited, yet we still see it trickle through from generation to generation. I think it's worth noting that corporal punishment in itself has always been seen as a fitting form of punishment for ill-disciplined learners and or disobedient children. And this dates back long before I was even in school, yet we still face the same problem in 2023.
Now, Statistics South Africa's report does sort of differentiate between the kinds of violence children experience in school. There is corporal punishment, there's verbal abuse, and then there's physical violence as well. So let's just unpack those three things, the three sort of ways that Stats SA has helped us understand what's happening in our schools: verbal abuse, corporal punishment, and physical violence.
So corporal punishment manifests itself in many different forms, right? This is learners being told at break time to go and kneel on the ground without any form of knee support. This includes pushed by an educator. This includes being hit on the bum, on the stick. Some people use chalk. Some people use board blasters. Then moving from that kind of corporal punishment, you move into what verbal abuse is. Now, this is the insults, or at least the verbalization that comes from educators insulting the learner, this being either on the side or most of the time in the presence of other learners. Closely attached to that is if you've got a learner who's not strong academically, being ridiculed by an educator based on that fact or whatever circumstance that learner finds themselves. Physical, as it suggests, this would ordinarily fall within the physical assault of a person. So this is physically hitting a person, pushing a person, pushing them against the wall in a form that affects them more physically in terms of their body.
Yeah, it's so incredibly disturbing. Also, the way that Statistics South Africa has broken this up is that about 6 out of 10 children, says Stats SA, experience corporal punishment. This was in 2019. These children are in schools in rural areas, so that's 6 out of 10 children. And then 7 out of 10 children who experience physical violence in schools, they're actually residents of urban areas.
I think it takes us back to some of the archaic notions, particularly in rural schools where spare the rod, spoil the child comes from, and therefore teachers feeling the need to have some upper hand and power over the learner, and therefore in order for them to get that power, at least upper hand, they resort to corporal punishment or physical treatment. I think the distinguishing factor in terms of how schools in rural areas administer it and how it is administered in more urbanized areas is an interesting fact, because you would assume that it would be the same across the board.
KwaZulu-Natal, according to Stats SA, also has the highest percentage of children who experience violence in schools, Pila-sande. So that's about 35% of children who experience violence in schools there in KZN. I mean, that's followed then by the Eastern Cape, 18%, Gauteng, 11%. But what is it about an area like KZN that makes this practice more prevalent there?
That's a very interesting question, Michelle, which I think would be interesting for one to do quite some research on. I mean, in terms of the clients that we get at the Equal Education Law Center, we wouldn't say that we get clients from a particular province or a particular area, but we do get clients just around the country. It is interesting that State SA would highlight the difference between those provinces, but I will mention that KZN and Eastern Cape are predominantly rural areas, and one begs the question of whether that plays any role at all.
I wonder what would be your advice this morning as Equal Education, Pila-sande, to parents whose children come home and tell them about instances like this, verbal abuse, corporal punishment, violence from teachers enacted on pupils. What would be the next step for this parent?
I think it's important to highlight to parents just how this thing of corporal punishment affects the learner on an educational front and on a mental health front, and the interconnectedness of those two. Because at the point where the learner starts feeling less confident, low self-esteem, and in a negative mental space, that affects their academic performance, which is likely to lead the learner into dropping out. In terms of recourses that are available to parents, parents are absolutely welcome to open a case with the South African Police Services. So this would be an assault case. Simultaneously, they are also able to report the matter to their closest district office or head of province. And lastly, they are absolutely able and well within their rights to lay a complaint with SACE, which is the professional body which educators and teachers are registered with in South Africa.
There have been so many, and thank you for that, Pila-sande. That's great advice and such an important point about that link between corporal punishment and a child's performance in school. Insofar as the issue is concerned, I've just lost my train of thought there. What I wanted to ask you, let me give myself a second to just think about it. But yeah, the protection of learners in schools, it's so incredibly important that learners themselves also know where to go. I mean, is there advice that you can give to parents on what the learner can do if they feel that they are being subjected to even verbal abuse?
The school has a responsibility first and foremost, right? Policies place clear roles and responsibilities in terms of what principals are supposed to do. We've got teams such as school-based support teams which are there to give psychosocial support to learners within the school environment. And at the point where a learner has experienced any form of corporal punishment or violence towards them, those doors should be open and should allow them to access some form of support and reporting and recourse mechanisms. Yeah. Where that is not possible, places like the Equal Education Law Center are available, where our services are for free and you don't need any airtime to contact us, because we've got a toll-free number, we've got a WhatsApp number which allows us to be accessible to everyone who needs our services.
Pila-sande, there have been so many instances of violence being reported in schools, knives being brought to schools, children being stabbed to death outside school premises, gangs flourishing in schools. One just wonders if there can be this link made between corporal punishment, violence enacted by teachers, and the violence that then spills out onto the playground.
Definitely. I mean, Michelle, children by their very nature are vulnerable people of society, and in most cases cannot defend themselves. And what happens in instances of corporal punishment is that a learner experiences corporal punishment and doesn't report and resorts to keeping it to themselves. What this does to the learner is that it pushes them, angers them, and leads them to much more delinquent behavior or despondent in terms of themselves as a person, but also how they interact with violence and how they interact with people in society, more especially learners, their peers, or other learners that they find themselves with in classrooms.
Now, you've given us some important avenues for parents and for pupils for them to go to if they are indeed experiencing corporal punishment, violence in schools. One of them is the toll-free number that you said Equal Education is available on. So if a parent does need to get in touch with Equal Education, you don't need airtime, as you said. Pila-sande, will you give us that number?
Yes, I will give you that number. If you just give me a second.
I'm also trying to Google it on my side.
Just hold on.
Okay, I've got it here. It's 0800 110 752. So now if we can get that number on our screens, this is Equal Education's toll-free number. If you or your child, or if you're a parent at home watching and your child has come home and reported mistreatment on the part of teachers against the child, be it corporal punishment, verbal abuse, be it physical violence, this is the number that you can call. It is 0800 110 752. This is Equal Education's toll-free line. And in Pila-sande, I think it's really important for us to just reiterate that this, if it is physical violence enacted on a child, this is grounds for opening a case with police.
Absolutely, absolutely. In terms of the law, corporal punishment is a criminal offence, and such assault case should be opened.
Pila-sande Mkuzo, let me thank you for your time this morning. An attorney with Equal Education's Law Centre. Incredibly important story, given what Statistics South Africa has said about the number of children that are still exposed to violence in schools. Pila-sande, thanks very much indeed.